Well, last week we kind of kicked off a little mini series that we're starting our year with, talking about specifically worship. And really kind of reframing everything in terms of what worship is, right? The word worship means worthship. It is something where we assign or ascribe worth and value to someone or something. And for many of us who struggle with our resolutions and trying to keep the resolutions and trying to make improvements in our life, but things just keep getting worse and we don't follow through on those commitments and everything seems to be falling apart. What we discovered last week is many of us, we don't necessarily have a financial problem, relationship problems, or health problems, or whatever it may be. What's at the root of it all is we have a worship problem. Our value system in life is completely backwards and messed up and in complete disarray and disorder. Right? We value things that we should not value, like so many who are losing everything in this life that they own, that they possess, that they found such comfort in, and in a moment it can be taken away. And isn't this what Jesus reminded us of? It says, build up and store up treasure in heaven, right? Where there's no rust to destroy, there's no moth to destroy, where everything is forever. Because everything in this life, guys, eventually it's all going to burn. Everything we value so much will eventually be kindling of the future. And so God challenges us in his word to value things rightly. When Jesus is at center, think of the solar system and all the planets revolving around it with such detail and intricacy. And if we're just a little bit closer, a little bit farther away, it's chaos, isn't it? Right? For life to be sustained, we need to stay in this orbit where the sun is at center. And where God's sun is at center of our lives, everything else finds its proper place. But who or what are we valuing more than him, and what is the result that it brings? When he's at center, everything else finds its place. However, unfortunately for many of us, we don't keep him at center very often. In fact, the thing that we have at center, I think most of us, more than anything else, is ourselves. Wouldn't you agree? And we want to deal with that today. Luke chapter 7 is where we're going to be camping out. Luke chapter 7, story that maybe you're familiar with. If not, great story that's going to be contrasting two individuals and their interactions with Jesus, God's Son. And we're going to see which one we can kind of relate with or identify with more, specifically keeping in mind who or what we value in our lives. I want to start reading Luke 7, verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him. And he went into the Pharisee's house, and he reclined at the table. And behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. Now, this phrase, by the way, when it's used like this, a notorious sinner, someone who had a reputation for being a sinner, typically was associated with those who were engaged in prostitution. All right, so keep that in mind as we're reading here. And everyone was aware of who she was. Someone who was a sinner. When she learned that Jesus was reclining at table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of ointment. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with the ointment. I mean, what a scene. Right, you've got this, most likely a prostitute who is known to be this sinner, barges into this environment where she was not invited, and she causes quite the scene, does she not? But she causes a scene in an effort to show her love for, her devotion to, and her worship of Jesus Christ. And I think we need to learn some things from her today. You contrast her especially with Simon, the one who was hosting this little get-together. Simon was a Pharisee, he was a religious leader, but what we're going to see and discover is that his motives of inviting Jesus over were probably very different than the motives of this woman as she tried to encounter Christ. Simon was maybe even doing Jesus a favor. I mean, he was this new and upcoming rabbi and had a lot of popularity with the people. So maybe he was trying to invite him in and getting him plugged into the religious leadership circles. Maybe it was all self-serving as well. He just wanted a little bit of entertainment for the evening. He'd heard the stories of Jesus. Maybe he wanted to meet him for himself. It was curiosity at best. And so he invited Jesus in to see what everything was all about, whereas this woman had very different motives coming with Jesus. And she gives us such a beautiful example of what true worship looks like, what it looks like to declare the ultimate worth and value of Christ in our lives, and to see how that brings order to the rest. She anointed him with ointment. Now, again, this sounds kind of like a weird thing, because when I come over to your house, if you invite me over, a lot of you haven't, that's cool, I'm not offended, but if you invited me over for dinner and I came over and you began with, I'd like to anoint you with some ointment, that'd be a little weird. I don't know what I would expect for the rest of the evening. That's not a cultural thing that we do today. But this was something that was so precious, especially for women in first century Palestine in this whole area. Many of them would keep this little vial that couldn't just be opened and closed. It was this precious vial that they would keep hung around their neck, and it represented such tremendous value. And so the idea is this woman took what was probably most costly to her, the most valuable thing she had, and she broke it and she emptied it over, anointing the feet of Jesus. Now, when they used to recline at table eating, the tables were very low, and it was a lot like the Eastern cultures even today, where they would just kind of sit down and kind of kneel, and their feet were behind them as they sat at table having a meal. And so the visual here is this woman came to the feet of Jesus and began to anoint him with this ointment. Many there had to have thought, why is she wasting that precious, valuable ointment in this kind of a way? I mean, she could have at least done it on his head, where it would have remained for some time and the fragrance would have remained. But as soon as Jesus left that place and the dirt and mire and grime of just walking around in those days, it would have completely done away with the ointments that she had just given. What we see in her action was a very clear act of offering and sacrifice. Here's why this matters, guys. Something we need to understand about true worship of God. Worship always involves sacrifice. Worship requires sacrifice. It's declaring the worth of someone, isn't it? And the worth or value of someone or something is always determined by its cost. What is the value of any given item? What someone is willing to pay for that item. And some things I don't even understand why people are willing to pay what they're willing to pay. Right? I'm not going to go into a lot of the digital stuff going on, but like the NFTs and non-fungible tokens. You guys looked into that stuff at all? And some of you would be like, that's my retirement. That's cool. I don't get it. I don't understand it because it's not real. Nothing's tangible. It's like this fake version, digital version of something. And yet people are paying tens of thousands, even upwards of $1 million plus for these NFTs. We spend on things that really have no value, but the value of anything is determined by its cost. True worship will cost us. It's going to cost us our time. It will cost us our attention, our affections, our thoughts, our emotions and feelings. It will cost us something in our lives. I'm reading right now. At night, I kind of just read before bedtime, and right now I'm currently reading Little Women. You guys ever read that novel? I'm rereading this one. Just before I look kind of sissy here, I just got through reading War and Peace and watching Braveheart, so we're good, right? But I'm reading Little Women. I'm like, it's been a while. I haven't read that. And my kids are in the show that they're doing a play, Little Women. I'm like, I want to reread this thing. And I got to this scene where, if you don't know the story, there's a family, not very well to do, a mom and her daughters. The dad's off at war at this point, and they have this Christmas meal. They don't have a lot, but they're having this Christmas meal, and the mom basically shares with her grown daughters that there's another family who has even less than they have, and they don't have a lot. But this other family has nothing. And she tells them about this family, and they decide together to take their meal, their breakfast that they had prepared for their own enjoyment and nourishment, and to bring it over to this needy family and give it to them. And I remember reading it even last night going, wow, what an incredible thing. Why? Because you and I, we're rarely even willing to sacrifice or give something to another when it just means we're going to have a little bit less. Let alone giving to someone when it means we will have nothing at all. And yet this woman took everything she had, all that was most precious and valuable to her, and gave it to Jesus. Guys, true worship will only cost you one thing. That's the good news. Here's the challenging news. That one thing is all of you. Right? This is what the Apostle Paul reminds us of. Romans 12, verse 1. Paul writes, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual what? Worship. What does Paul say? You want to worship Jesus? Here's how you do it. Bring all of yourself. Present yourself on the altar. We're living sacrifices, though, and he acknowledges that. Why? Because living sacrifices keep trying to crawl off the altar. Right? So we have got to be able to choose volitionally to present ourselves that way, saying, Jesus, all of me is yours. There's nothing that I have that hasn't come from you and isn't yours to begin with. So all I can do is offer back to you what already belongs to you. I offer all of myself to you as sacrifice. We will never experience actual worship until we are willing to sacrifice and present ourselves as that living sacrifice, to get over ourselves. And guys, that is the most difficult thing for many of us to do. The greatest obstacle for us when it comes to knowing God more, truly worshiping him, seeing his work in and through our lives, what he wants to do in us. The greatest obstacle, we can't get over ourselves. We're so self-focused in our society, our culture, and as individuals, it is all about me. And it's evidenced even here. When we look at the example of this woman, most of us would never have done what she was willing to do. We would have been far too concerned, even with how we were going to look in the eyes of other people. The reputation, the notoriety we would have felt we had would have kept us out of this environment where we wouldn't want to be judged even more. We wouldn't want people to look at us and give us those looks and roll the eyes knowing what they were thinking. The opinion of others matters much too greatly to us, does it not? Think about even being here as we worship together on Sunday. How aware many of us are of other people in the room. Maybe you were reluctant to even come to service today. You weren't really sure about it because you're going through some stuff. Isn't it weird how we feel this need to get our lives cleaned up before we come to church? It's a strange thing, isn't it? Not like this woman. I mean, her life was a train wreck. She knew she needed to get to Jesus no matter what. A lot of us were like, yeah, things aren't good right now. I'm making some bad choices. And I know I need to get back right with the Lord and get back in church and just kind of be a part of that. I don't know. I need to get my act together first. And what are we doing? All we're doing is getting our act together, learning how to perform and put on the face. It's like people who are sick, diseased, dying, going, you know what? I just need to get healthy before I go to the ER. Doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's what this is about, is coming to a place to become healthy, to become healed and whole by what Jesus wants to do in our lives. But we're so reluctant because we care so much about what others think of us. This woman with a terrible reputation came right into a home and a party that nobody invited her to. She couldn't care less what other people might be thinking about her. Right? What was the scene? She wet his feet with her tears. She anointed them with this ointment. She wiped his feet with her hair, kissing his feet. I mean, this was a scene, you guys. And none of this would have been considered socially acceptable or proper at the time. You know, a woman would never even let her hair down in public. It was supposed to be covered or at least up. That was the socially acceptable norm. And so she let the hair down. The kind of physical contact, kissing his feet. I mean, oftentimes a good host would wash the feet of his guests. But kissing them, that's a little over the top. It doesn't matter how good of a host or how hospitable you might be. Again, if you invite me over for dinner, please don't. It's going to be uncomfortable for everybody. Right? So this whole scene and what this woman was engaging in would have been improper, socially unacceptable. Now, I'm not saying by any means that she came in trying to make a statement or to cause a scene. And there's a difference there, isn't there? She didn't come in going, I'm going to disrupt this religious, ceremonial, stuffy kind of a scene, and I'm going to show everybody how much I love Jesus. That wasn't her purpose at all. A lot of times we can kind of get into that mindset. I think we can still be reminded here that anything we do that clearly is drawing attention to us, to ourselves, in the context of worship, isn't really worship anymore. Because it's taking the focus, the worth and value, the attention off of Christ and putting it on ourselves. And I've had some come that just had a hard time with this. I talked with one lady who told me just straight up, listen, if I'm worshiping here at church and God tells me I need to run around the room screaming like a chicken, that's exactly what I'm going to do. I said, listen, I'm okay with that because I'm pretty confident God is not ever going to ask you to do that. Why? Because if you do that, where's the attention? It's on you. Where's the focus? It's on you. Yeah, it's you and the Lord, but he's given you the privilege of you and the Lord with your brothers and sisters in Christ. And everything we do wants to bring the attention and focus back to him. Right? Otherwise, it's not worship anymore at all. Right? So please set aside your chicken spirit and be reminded of what worship truly is about. Worship is when we are so caught up in our love for Jesus that everything and everyone else melts away. That we are there knowing we're in his presence, this God, this Savior, this Redeemer who gave everything for us, who forgave our sin, who took away our shame and our guilt that we carried with us our entire lives, who pours his grace lavishly out upon us when we don't deserve anything good, and yet he constantly brings good blessings to our lives. He is there when we hurt and we suffer. He is near to the brokenhearted. In our darkest moments, he meets us there and shines his light in, saying, I love you, I am here, stay with me. Right? This Savior that we get to worship, we come into his presence. And we have to be so overwhelmed by his love for us that everything else just disappears. Isn't that the example of this woman? She didn't come in to cause a scene, to make a statement. She just looked at Jesus and said, he's the one who forgives my sin and takes away my shame. And I'm not going to let anyone or anything keep me from him. And I'm not going to keep anything from him. I'm going to pour it all out in his presence. He is worthy of all that I have. Simon, on the other hand, he kept things nice and respectable. He was very aware of the people that were with him. He was very aware of their opinions and with keeping up appearances. Guys, here on Sunday mornings, I see it. I see how many of us are restricted by our own self-focus and how we might look to others. And I'm not pointing a finger just out at you this way. I'm acknowledging to you right now, even as a pastor, where I'm like paid to be good, paid to try to be this example, right? That's how a lot of people think of it. And yet, even as a pastor, I'm telling you right now, I struggle. I struggle with what you all may think. There have been moments where I've been in worship and I felt like God has called me in that moment, get on your knees. Just get on your knees, kneel down right now, even though I know I'm in front. And I don't think of, what are people going to think of me? Are they going to think that I'm some kind of weak person? I don't care. I am. But what I struggle with is anyone here going, well, that's a little showy. What is he trying to be all spiritual, more so than anybody else? Is this all an act? Is this all a performance? And I start thinking all of these thoughts. And to my great shame, there have been times where I felt like God said, kneel, and I stood on my feet. And I didn't kneel. I didn't want to take that posture of humility and submission to the Lord. Guys, so you know, that's all any of it ever is positioning and posturing ourselves in submission to God, because he has worth and value, not us. And so, Lord, I submit myself to you. When we're raising hands, right, we hear this all the time, but isn't it an act of submission? Right? If there's soldiers that are surrendering to the opposing forces, what do? My one time paintballing, that's what I did. I just walked around like that. Don't hit me. Don't hit me. I'm out. Right? And it's also this act of just reaching and trying to just grab hold of everything Jesus has for us in his presence and who he is. But we don't want to do that because are people going to think we're trying to be all spiritual? Maybe they might think there's something wrong, right? If I actually kneel, and I know it's a little difficult here in the worship center, rows are tight. How badly do you want it? No, that's not the point. Right? But if I actually kneel, we start thinking through, are they going to think that I'm like really like this terrible sinner and I'm just repenting right now and I've got all these issues. I don't want to think I've got a bunch of issues, so I'll just kind of stay standing. Maybe God's Spirit has moved you and you felt like, I just want to even maybe close my eyes and just focus in on him and put a hand up, but we're so reluctant to do it because of the opinions of other people. And we're missing what worship is about entirely. That reckless abandon of God, my life is yours. You are worthy of all things. And then things get interesting here. Verse 39. Now when the Pharisee who had invited Jesus saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. So please hear, guys, as I'm talking about this woman, her example, saying she didn't care about the opinions of others, this isn't a message where I'm saying, and she was worried for no reason because no one was thinking anything about her. Actually, they were judging her. Whatever she might have feared was actually taking place. She just considered Jesus more important. Simon said this to himself. I don't know if you caught that too, but Simon said this to himself. In verse 40, Jesus answering said to him, did you guys catch that? Can you imagine if you thought something in your own head and I responded with, let me answer the question you just asked yourself. What did Jesus say? Simon, I have something to say to you. And he answered, say it, teacher, having no idea what's about to happen. And Jesus tells a very quick story. He says, a certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. When they could not pay, he canceled the debt of both. Now, which one of them will love him more? Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. And he said to him, you have judged rightly. And then turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but from the time I came in, she has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head with oil, but she has anointed my feet with ointment. Therefore, I tell you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, your sins are forgiven. Then those who were at table with him began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Jesus here gets to the root of Simon's problem. And like most of us, for all the issues, it all comes down to a matter of the heart. It's the same problem that keeps many of us from true worship of God, which is this: self-esteem and self-importance. It all comes back to the self. The most valuable thing in my life is me. So I can't declare the great worth and value of God so everything finds its rightful place because I am at the center of my own universe. And I refuse to abdicate that spot, that place. A certain moneylender had two debtors. This is the beginning of this story. Jesus wanting to make sure Simon understood something we need to be reminded of today, guys. You ready? Every one of us is born into this world, and as we live our lives, we are debtors to God. We owe him a debt we could never pay. Remember the old song? Right? He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. I needed someone to wash my sins away. Every one of us is a debtor to God. Think about this. Have you ever hurt or wronged another person in your life? Liars, if your hand is not up. You are wronging me right now. making me feel awkward needlessly. Every one of us in here, right, has hurt or wounded another person through what we've said, what we've done, what we haven't said, what we haven't done. We have all wronged someone. When we wrong that person, something in us feels a sense of debt toward that person. At least anyone with even a remotely healthy conscience, don't we? We now owe that person. We want to redeem our wrong. We want to restore that relationship. We want restitution in that relationship to make sure they know how sorry we are, that was not going to happen again. We want to make things right. It is settling the debt. And so we hurt others, we're indebted to them. Others hurt us. We feel that they're indebted to us. They owe us. Come on, anybody who's married understands this dynamic. We all have a little copy of what I like to refer to as the marriage scorecard. And we keep score every moment of every day. And some of y'all have decades worth of record keeping. And you pull it out in the most random times. You get into an argument about dishes today, and you're like, in 78, this is what you did. Like, oh my goodness, how are we remembering back that far? But we keep this record of wrongs because we want to use it as a ledger. This is what you owe me. We like to feel that we know our marriage has issues, and of course we're aware it takes two to tango. Of course we're aware that both parties have to contribute to the dysfunction. We know we've contributed and we've done our part, but what do we really think? We've done this much. They've done this much. And we have our ledger that pulls out all of the debt. It's really their fault that I'm such an angry, bitter person. It's your fault that our marriage is not as healthy as it should be. We keep score. Guys, our debt to God, hear this, includes the full weight of every sin you have ever committed toward another person. Why? Because that is an image bearer of His that He has created and loves. It includes every sin and wrong you've ever done to another person, as well as every prideful, self-serving thought, attitude, or words spoken, or anything you have ever done or disposition of your heart. That's encouraging, isn't it? Add it all up. All up. And that is the debt that we owe to God. And we try to pay off that debt by kind of stop doing the wrong things and bad things, and let's start doing better things and nicer things. The problem is that every good thing we do is done with wrong motives, and so it just adds to our debt. What Scripture tells us is that there is a day of reckoning coming. Right? One owed 500, the other 50. In other words, yeah, we can admit that some people are worse sinners than others. Or I might even say some of you are better at sinning than others. And we use this to our advantage, right? If I know my sin, I make myself feel better by comparing myself to other people who we know have a greater debt to God because they're more messed up than me. There's no shortage of terrible sinners in our world that we can compare ourselves to. I mean, you feel bad about your sin, just think about the person sitting next to you. They're way worse. Way worse. As here's the point Jesus is making sure we understand here. Others may owe more than us, but we both owe. Right, James chapter 2, verse 10, whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become guilty of what? All of it. We are law transgressors and breakers. Right? Neither one of these debtors could pay off their debt. Even though we may owe less, we still owe, and we can't pay what we owe. We don't have it within us to pay God back this debt that we owe Him. Someone else may owe 10 times more than us, but the payment is still due. Your buddy may have gotten knocked out of the game of Monopoly because they landed on Boardwalk with a hotel. And it bankrupted them, they're done. But if you are out of cash and you have nothing, you have no assets, you can land on Baltic Avenue. Baltic, people. And if the rent is $6, guess what? Game over. Because you don't have $6. You're done. We look at the size of the debt instead of reminding ourselves we can't pay it. The day of reckoning and judgment is coming when our account with God will be settled. We don't know when it is. It can happen at any moment, but it is going to come. We will stand before the judge of all the earth who will do right in all of his holiness and glory. And every excuse and every rationalization and every comparison will be gone. It is us and him looking into the holy eyes of fire. And in that moment, the day of judgment, what do we come to him with? Do we come to him with all of our debt that has not been paid? Because someone's going to pay it, and the only way to pay it is through your life, or through the life of his son that he freely gave to us. As Colossians 2 tells us, Jesus canceled the record of debt that stood against us with its legal demands. This he set aside, nailing it to the cross. Jesus says, he who is forgiven little loves little. And by inference, we can conclude, right, deducing he who is forgiven much loves much. The worth we assign to Jesus will be directly proportional to the sin we are willing to acknowledge in ourselves. To seeing ourselves rightly, right? Last week, we talked about this obstacle to worship being a lesser, a diminished or deflated view of God. We don't understand who he is in his holiness. Today, the message is that another obstacle to worship is a greater or overinflated perception of ourselves, right? We think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. We don't know who we really are. Isn't this the essence of this whole exchange, Jesus and Simon? Simon's thinking to himself, well, if this guy really was a prophet, he would know who this woman is and not allow her to touch him. And Jesus, his response was essentially, Simon, if you knew who you really were and who I am, you would have joined her. You would have been right there with her at her feet, worshiping me the way she is here. If you really knew who I am and who you are apart from me. We don't realize, or maybe some of us here today have forgotten who we are, who we were without Jesus. We've gotten so used to, comfortable with our identity as children of God. And this can be a good thing, but it can also be taken to a point where we lose sight of the awe of redemption and the forgiveness we have because of the blood of Christ. We just kind of hear the gospel. Yeah, the gospel. You know, Jesus died for us. He loves us. He forgave our sin. Woohoo! What's on TV? Instead of understanding, reminding ourselves daily of the price that Jesus paid that we could not have paid ourselves. Ephesians 2:1 reminds us, you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Dead. Not just like needing a little bit of help and a little boost up the ladder. Guys, we were dead without life. Imagine me being here today, right in the middle of teaching, boom, I go down, collapse. I go into full cardiac arrest in that moment. Someone here jumps up, runs up to the front, grabs the defibrillator, comes up, gets me back, gets a heart going again, brings back life, gets me to the hospital, full recovery. What do you think my attitude toward that person is going to be? Do you think there will ever be a moment where I think of that person and just go, oh yeah, they're cool? This person that brought me back my life here on earth, there will be a debt of gratitude, won't there? That for the rest of my life, I love them and care for them, and they have a place in my life and my heart, my thinking that nobody else does. And how could they not? I mean, I'm well past the point of having kids, but I'd be telling my kids, when you have kids, name them after this person. You know, if it's Joseph, Joe, name your kid Joe. If it's a daughter, Josephina, I don't know, something. Just to acknowledge, to honor what this person has done. And yet we become so complacent with what Jesus has done for us. And so we don't worship because we're too aware of what others are going to think, too aware of everybody around us. Don't want to look foolish. Don't want to position or posture ourselves in a posture of submission and surrender. Because we still have too much pride, too much self-confidence, self-righteousness, and we don't understand our sin and the debt we owe God that Jesus paid for us.